So suppose somebody comes up to you and says to you that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John didn't actually write the Gospels in the New Testament. There's a lot of skeptics that say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John had nothing to do with the Gospels that are in your New Testament, and that whoever did write the Gospels, they didn't have any access to eyewitness testimony or any firsthand evidence about Jesus. Somebody like, say, there's a skeptic named Bart Ehrman, and he says the New Testament Gospels were written not by people who were eyewitnesses, but by people living later. Now, his evidence for that is the fact that the Gospels, the titles of them are phrased gospel according to, like gospel according to Matthew, gospel according to Mark, and so on. And according to, gospel according to, or a book written according to, that actually wasn't a real typical way of describing a book in the ancient world. So he says at some point, somebody had to standardize these titles, and when they did, they just made up the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because they were trying to connect them to people that were familiar to the audience that they were aiming these Gospels at. So here's what, again, Bart Ehrman has to say. He says, the Gospels that came to be included in the New Testament were all written anonymously. When Christians recognized that they needed apostolic authorities, they attributed these books to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and scholars continue to call these books Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, not because, according to Ehrman, because they actually wrote these books, but just as a matter of convenience. And so that really challenges us as Christians. Is it true that the Gospels weren't actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? And if they weren't, what does that mean for our faith and for what we believe about the truthfulness of these texts? But here's the thing. There are at least 3 reasons why I think we can be really sure that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were the sources behind these texts. Here's the first one. Consistent testimony outside the New Testament lets us know that these Gospels have been linked to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John from the very beginning. I could just point to a couple of different sources. In the 2nd century, early 2nd century, there's a guy named Papias of Hierapolis. And here's what he had to say about the Gospels. He said, Mark, Peter's interpreter, wrote whatever he remembered from Peter. So he was Peter's interpreter, his translator, we might say, Mark was. And he wrote what he learned from Peter as Peter's translator. Same thing with Matthew, that Matthew's gospel can be traced back to the tax collector named Matthew. You have another source in the 2nd century, so only talking decades after these texts were originally written, Irenaeus of Lyon. He writes this book called Against Heresies. And in that, he mentions Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and ties those to precisely the people that we believe wrote those texts. Matthew, the tax collector, Mark, the interpreter or translator of Simon Peter, Luke, a companion of Paul, and John, the apostle, is who he ties them to. And so we see this external evidence says that these texts were actually written by the people that they're ascribed to in your Bible. But it's not just external evidence. It's also the ancient manuscripts. You see, Bart Ehrman, the skeptic, he says that the Gospels circulated anonymously for decades before anyone ever connected them to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But let's think for a moment. What would have happened if these texts actually did circulate anonymously for decades with no titles? Well, here's a way to think about this. Think about Led Zeppelin. Now, you may not have thought a lot about Led Zeppelin, but Led Zeppelin in 1971 released what is one of the greatest albums of all time. It is an album that doesn't have a title. All it has as its title is 4 symbols. Now, that particular record, that particular album, by its own record company, is called 3 different titles. It's called Led Zeppelin 4, it's called 4 Symbols, and it's called the 4th album. And the fans of this album have called it Untitled, they've called it Runes, they've even called it Zoso. There's all these different things it has been called. And so let's think about this for a moment. When something is sent out without a title, multiple titles emerge. Multiple variant titles, at least 6 different titles for Led Zeppelin's 4th album. Now you may think, what on earth does Led Zeppelin have to do with the Gospels? Well, think about this. If the Gospels had actually been circulated anonymously, completely anonymously, what we ought to find in the manuscripts of the Gospels is all different names for the manuscripts. In other words, the Gospel according to Matthew, what we call that might be called by one person, Gospel according to Andrew, Gospel of Andrew. Somebody else might have called it Gospel of Philip. They would have added all sorts of different titles to these Gospels or titles that didn't even mention the author at all. But here's what we actually find starting in the early 3rd century when the manuscripts begin to survive in a sufficiently holistic form. That is to say, they're not just fragments of manuscripts, but whole manuscripts. When they start to survive in a form where you can find a title, they all have titles, and guess what? All of them ascribe the gospel to the same authors. Matthew's gospel always bears the name Matthew once it survives sufficiently intact for you to find a title on it. The same with Mark, the same with Luke, the same with John. There's a consistency that would not be there if they had circulated anonymously. Here's the last reason. If the names of the authors had been fabricated later, they wouldn't have chosen the 4 names we have on the Gospels. Yeah, Matthew maybe, John certainly, but Mark and Luke, they would not have chosen those 2 names. If they were trying to connect the gospel according to Mark to Peter and they were just making things up, they would have called it the gospel according to Peter. They wouldn't have called it the gospel according to Mark, and Luke especially. Luke is barely mentioned in the New Testament. If you're wanting to connect this gospel to Paul, call it gospel according to Paul. Or if you're wanting to connect it to a companion of Paul, call it gospel according to Timothy, or better yet, call it gospel according to Timothy Paul. That's a great name right there. But whatever it is, you're not going to ascribe a gospel to Luke if, in fact, Luke didn't write it. Christians, from the very beginning, they knew who wrote these Gospels. And it was Matthew and Mark and Luke and John.